When I asked my daughter-in-law what time the gallery opening started, she laughed and said, "Oh, that's tonight, but it's really more of an industry thing. You'd be bored stiff." 6 days later, she was standing on my porch in the rain, mascara running, begging me not to let the building go to auction. I just looked at her and said, "I thought you handled all that yourselves now." I'm 64 years old, and I spent most of those years believing that if you gave enough, eventually, people would learn to give back. I was wrong about that, but I didn't find out how wrong until a cold Tuesday in March, in a kitchen that still smelled like the coffee my wife used to make, even though she's been gone 3 winters now. Her name was Helen. We had one son, Gregory, and from the day he was born, she used to say he was going to do something that mattered. She wasn't pushy about it, not the way some mothers are. She just believed in him so completely that he started believing in himself, and somewhere along the way, that belief turned into a young man who got into a good school on a partial scholarship and a not-so-good loan that I quietly paid down for 11 years without ever mentioning it to him. I run a small heating and cooling business outside Toledo, have for 38 years. It isn't glamorous work. You crawl through other people's attics in August and their crawl spaces in January, and you learn pretty quick that nobody respects the man who keeps them warm until the day the furnace dies. But it put food on the table, it paid for Helen's treatments at the end, and it gave Gregory the start he needed. He married Tessa the spring after he finished his residency. She came from money, or at least from people who acted like they had it, and I remember Helen squeezing my hand at the wedding and whispering that she hoped the girl would be good to him. I told her of course she would. I had no reason to think otherwise back then. Tessa was polished and quick with a smile, and she called me Dad in front of people in a way that felt warm at the time and only later started to feel like a performance. Gregory became an orthopedic surgeon when he and Tessa decided to leave the hospital system and open a private practice over in the suburbs of Columbus. I drove down to see the building before they signed anything. It was a beautiful spot, an old brick storefront they wanted to gut and modernize, with big windows facing a street where the kind of people they wanted as patients like to walk their dogs and sip their coffee. The problem was the money. Even a surgeon doesn't walk into that kind of build-out with cash in hand, and the bank wanted a guarantor on the commercial mortgage. Someone with assets. Someone with 38 years of clean credit and a paid-off house and a business that, while small, had never once missed a payment on anything. So, I co-signed. I put my name in my house behind a loan for $1.1 million. And I did it without a second's hesitation, because that's what Helen would have wanted. And because he was my boy. I didn't tell anyone. Not even Gregory, really. Understood what I'd put on the line. To him, it was paperwork. To me, it was everything I had. The practice did well. It did better than well. Within 2 years, they'd moved into a 5-bedroom house with a circular driveway, and Tessa was driving a German SUV that cost more than my first home. I told myself I was happy for them. Mostly I was, but I noticed the calls got shorter. I noticed I stopped getting invited to things, or I'd hear about them after the fact. Helen used to be the one who kept the family stitched together. And without her, the threads just sort of came loose, and nobody on the other end seemed to feel the cold the way I did. Then they decided to open the gallery. That's what they called it anyway. Gregory had gotten into collecting art, the way men with new money sometimes do, and Tessa convinced him to lease a second space downtown to display the collection and host events. A vanity project, my late wife would have called it, though she'd have said it kinder than that. They were throwing a grand opening, a real catered affair, and I'd heard about it the way I heard about most things now, secondhand, from a cousin who assumed I'd already been told. I called Gregory on that Tuesday morning to ask about it. I stood at my kitchen counter stirring sugar into a mug I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands. He picked up on the 4th ring, distracted, and before I could really get into it, I heard Tessa's voice in the background, and then suddenly she had the phone. "Dad," she said in that bright, brittle tone. "What time does it start?" "Oh, honey, it's tonight actually, but honestly, it's more of an industry thing. Collectors, a few of Gregory's colleagues, some people from the magazine doing a write-up. You'd be bored stiff. It's not really your scene, not really my scene." I stood there with the spoon still in my hand, and I felt something go very quiet inside me. "I see," I said. "I just wanted to know if there was anything I could bring." "That's so sweet," she said. "The way you talk to a child, but it's all handled. We've got it covered." And then she said the thing I haven't been able to stop hearing since. She lowered her voice like she was sharing something just between us, and she said, "You understand, right? The whole point is to look established. It's about the image." The image. I was the wrong image for my own son's party. I said something polite. I always say something polite. I hung up and I stood in that kitchen for a long time, and I looked at the second coffee cup I still set out every morning, out of a habit I can't seem to break. And I thought about Helen. And I thought about every attic and every crawl space and every Christmas Eve I'd spent fixing a stranger's heat, instead of sitting with my own family. Also, my boy could grow up to host a party where I'd be the wrong image. I'd like to tell you I cried. I didn't. Somewhere around noon, something in me went from hurt to clear, the way the air goes clear after a storm finally breaks, and I made a decision. I decided I was going to go see this gallery for myself. I didn't go to the opening. I'm not the kind of man who shows up where he isn't wanted to make a scene. But 2 days later, I drove the 2.5 hours down to Columbus, and I parked across the street from that downtown space, and I just sat and watched for a while, the way you'd watch weather coming in. The windows were enormous. The art inside was lit up like a museum, and on the glass door, in gold lettering, was the name of the gallery, and underneath it, in smaller letters, the name of the leasing company that held the building. I knew that company. I knew it because I'd done my homework 2 years earlier when I co-signed everything, and I'd kept doing my homework ever since, because 38 years in business teaches you to read the fine print even when it's your own family on the page. The gallery wasn't a separate venture. Tessa had folded the lease into the practice's holding company, the same company whose mortgage carried my name and my house as the guarantee. To make the numbers work, they'd leveraged the practice to cover the gallery's build-out, and the first year of that downtown lease, they'd reached into the same well I dug my name into, and they hadn't said a word. I sat there in my truck across the street, an old man nobody inside would have recognized, and I watched the kind of people who were the right image laugh and drink wine, paid for, in part, by a heating and cooling man from Toledo who wasn't allowed in the door. When I got home that night, I called the bank. Not in anger. I want to be clear about that. I called the way you call when you finally decide to stop pretending you don't have a choice. I'd been with that bank for 31 years. The branch manager, a level-headed woman about my age, knew me by name, knew Helen's name, had set flowers when she passed. I told her I wanted to understand exactly where I stood on the guarantee I'd signed. We talked for the better part of an hour, and what I learned was that I had been carrying the entire structure on my back without anyone, least of all me, ever really saying it out loud. My house, my credit, my signature. If the practice's holding company missed its obligations, the bank wasn't going to chase Gregory's circular driveway first. They were going to come to the guarantor. They were going to come to me. I had assumed all this time that I was helping. What I learned that night was that I was the only thing standing between my son's whole glittering life and the bottom falling out of it. And he didn't even know it. And his wife had just told me I was the wrong image to stand in the room I was paying for. I want to tell you what I did next, but first I want to tell you what I didn't do. I didn't call them up and scream. I didn't threaten anybody. I've buried a wife, and I've watched men I worked beside for decades get planted in the ground, and I've learned that the loud kind of anger is usually the weakest kind. The strong kind is quiet. The strong kind makes a plan and waits. Here's what I'd also learned in that long phone call. The original mortgage had a clause, standard in these things, that allowed the guarantor to request a review of the loan structure if there had been a material change in how the borrowed funds were being used. Folding a luxury gallery and a downtown lease into the practice's debt without notifying the guarantor was, in the bank's careful words, the kind of material change that would warrant review. I could, if I wished, formally withdraw my willingness to extend the guarantee when the loan came up for its scheduled renewal, which it was going to do in 19 days. Without my guarantee, the bank wouldn't renew on the same terms. They'd want the loans substantially paid down or refinanced at rates that would gut a practice already overextended on a vanity gallery. The numbers, the manager explained gently, were not good. Whoever had structured this had been betting on a guarantor who'd never look too closely and never walk away. They bet wrong. I told the manager I needed a few days to think, which was true. Then I drove home, and I slept better than I had in a year. For the next 2 weeks, I lived my normal life. I went to work. I had breakfast at the diner on Wednesdays like always. I called Gregory once, on a Sunday, and we talked for 9 minutes about nothing, about the weather and a ball game, and I told him I loved him before I hung up, because I did and I do, and that was never what any of this was about. He had no idea anything was different. Neither did she. The call came on a Thursday, 6 days before the renewal date. I was eating supper alone, a frozen dinner I'm not proud of, and the phone rang, and it was Tessa, and the brittle brightness was gone from her voice. It had been replaced by something I'd never heard from her before. Fear. "Dad," she said, and the word came out shaking. "Thank God, we have a problem. The bank called Gregory today. They're saying something about the loan renewal, that the guarantee's been pulled, that they're not going to renew unless we come up with..." "Dad, they're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars by next week, or they start foreclosure proceedings on the building. Both buildings, the practice and the gallery." She took a ragged breath. "Did you do something? Did you talk to them?" I set down my fork. I let the silence sit there a moment. The way you let a furnace cool before you put your hand in. "I asked them some questions," I said. "About the guarantee I signed, the one on the loan you used to build your gallery. The gallery I wasn't the right image to attend." I heard her start to cry. Not the polished, controlled woman I'd known for 9 years. Something underneath it. "We didn't mean..." "Dad, please. Gregory could lose everything. The house, the practice, everything we've built. You have to help us. You're the only one who can fix this." And there it was. After all the shortened phone calls and the parties I heard about secondhand and the morning she told me I'd be bored stiff at my own son's celebration, in the end, I was still the one they came to. Not because they loved me. Because I was useful. Because I was, and had always been, the well they reached into when they were thirsty. I'm not going to pretend there wasn't a part of me that wanted to savor it. There was. I'd be lying if I said the panic in her voice didn't land somewhere deep and satisfy something that had been aching for 2 years. But I'm 64, and I've been a father for 35 of those years, and I've learned that the man who wins by destroying his own child hasn't won anything at all. So I said, "I want to talk to Gregory. Just Gregory. Tomorrow, he drives up here, alone." He came the next afternoon. My boy, my surgeon's son, sat at the same kitchen table where he'd done his homework as a kid, and for the first time in years, he actually looked at me. Really looked. And I saw that he didn't know. He honestly hadn't known what I'd signed, what I'd risked, how the gallery had been built on the back of my name and my house. Tessa had handled the finances. He'd handled the patience. He'd let himself not look, the same way a man lets himself not look at a lot of things when looking would be uncomfortable. I didn't yell at him. I told him the truth instead, which was harder and slower, and made him cry in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. I told him about the 11 years of loan payments he never knew about. I told him about co-signing $1 million without a word. I told him about Helen and what she'd hoped, and how somewhere along the line being his father had turned into being his collateral. And I told him about standing on the street outside his gallery, watching people who were the right image, knowing I wasn't allowed in the door I'd paid for. "I'm not going to let the practice go under," I said finally. "You're my son. I co-signed because I believe in you, and I still do, but things are going to change." The gallery was sold. Tessa fought it, but the numbers didn't lie, and Gregory, to his credit, didn't fight me on it. The proceeds paid down the loan to a level the bank would renew without my house on the line. I removed my name from the guarantee entirely. For the first time in 2 years, the roof over my head belonged to me and me alone, and not to a downtown space full of art I'd never been invited to see. But that wasn't the part that mattered. The part that mattered came a few weeks later, when Gregory called and asked quietly if he could bring me down for dinner. Just dinner. At their house. And when I got there, Tessa met me at the door, and the brittle smile was gone, and she said something I never thought I'd hear from her. She said she was sorry. Not the smooth, image-conscious sorry I'd have expected. A real one. The kind that cost something. I'd be lying if I said everything healed overnight. It didn't. Trust doesn't pour back the way it pours out. But Gregory started calling on his own, not when he needed something, just to talk. He drove up one Saturday and helped me clean out Helen's sewing room, something I'd been putting off for 3 years. And we found her old recipe cards, and we made her chili together and burned half of it and laughed until we couldn't breathe. He started asking about the business, about the early years, about his mother, the way a son does when he finally understands his parents were people before they were parents. I still set out 2 coffee cups every morning. I don't think I'll ever stop, but these days the second one gets used about once a week when my boy drives up to sit at his mother's table and talk to his father like a man who knows, finally, what he's got. I learned something, late in life, that I wish I'd known when I was crawling through those attics, dreaming of the man my son would become. Love isn't measured by how much you're willing to give. Any fool can give until there's nothing left, and plenty of us do, and we call it devotion when really it's just fear wearing a kind face. Real love knows when to give and when to stop. It knows that a person who will only respect you for what you provide will never respect you at all, and that the kindest thing you can sometimes do for the people you love most is to make them stand on their own 2 feet and find out who they really are. My name was the wrong image for a party, but it turned out to be exactly the right name on the only document that ever really mattered. And in the end, I didn't lose my son. I found him. I just had to be willing to walk away from him first to do it. For 2 years, I told myself that giving was the same as loving, and it took standing on a cold street outside a gallery I'd paid for to finally see the difference. Everything that happened to Gregory and Tessa happened for a reason, and the reason was sitting right there in my own choices. I had taught them, without ever meaning to, that I would always be the well they could reach into. 11 years of quiet loan payments, a $1 million signature I never mentioned, a second coffee cup set out every morning out of a love so heavy it had started to look like weakness. When you hand people everything and ask for nothing, don't be surprised when they learn to expect everything and offer nothing. That isn't cruelty on their part. That's just what we train them to do, one act of fear dressed as kindness at a time. The day I called the bank, I didn't act out of spite. I acted out of something I should have found years earlier. It took a certain clear-eyed honesty to read the fine print on my own family and admit what I'd let myself become. It took the steadiness to wait 19 days instead of 19 minutes, to let a plan do its work instead of letting my temper do its damage. And it took more backbone than I knew I had to drive home that night, sleep soundly, and let the people I loved feel the full weight of consequences I'd spent years cushioning them from. None of that came naturally to me. I'm a man who fixes furnaces. I'd spent my whole life keeping other people warm. Learning to let my own son feel the cold for a little while was the hardest thing I ever did. But here is what I know now that I didn't know stirring sugar into that coffee. Real character isn't built by people who rescue you. It's built by people who love you enough to let you stand on your own and find out what you're made of. The night Tessa cried on the phone, I could have stayed the well forever and bought myself the illusion of being needed. Instead, I chose the harder kindness. And because I did, my son sat at his mother's table and became a man instead of a patient waiting for his next refill of someone else's strength. If you take anything from an old man who got it wrong for a long time, take this. Do right by people, but never confuse doing right with being a doormat. Sharpen your judgment until you can tell the difference between someone who loves you and and someone who uses you, because the two can wear the very same smile. And when life finally asks you to do the brave, lonely thing, the thing that costs you something, find the grit to do it anyway. I lost a gallery I was never invited into. I gained a son who calls just to talk. I'd burn that gallery down again 100 times over for one more Saturday burning chili in Helen's kitchen with my boy.